The Midnight Stroll, a tale of why you shouldn't walk through a cemetery at midnight. It was a crisp October night, the kind of night when the wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The moon hung low, full and bright, casting an eerie glow across the town of Black Hollow. The streets were silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant bark of a dog. Most people were in their homes, safe and warm, but not Alex. Alex was the kind of person who thrived on adrenaline. Haunted houses, ghost tours, and urban legends were his bread and butter. So when he overheard a group of kids talking about how no one dared walk through the old Black Hollow cemetery at midnight, he couldn't resist the challenge. Scared of a few tombstones? Alex scoffed to himself as he pulled on his jacket and laced up his boots. Please. The cemetery wasn't far from his apartment, just a 10-minute walk if you took the shortcut through the park. As he made his way toward the gates, his footsteps echoed on the pavement, the sound almost swallowed by the thick, still air. The entrance to Black Hollow Cemetery was old, with wrought iron gates that groaned in protest as Alex pushed them open. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop. The wind died down, and an unnatural stillness settled over the place. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath his boots as he made his way deeper into the cemetery. Rows of headstones stood like sentinels, their inscriptions worn and faded by time. Towering above them were gnarled trees, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Piece of cake, Alex muttered, glancing at his watch. It was 11:45 p.m. He had 15 minutes to kill before the true test of his bravery would begin. As he wandered through the rows of graves, he found himself drawn toward a section of the cemetery he'd never noticed before. The headstones here were older, their edges crumbling and covered in moss. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around his ankles as he walked. Despite his bravado, Alex felt a slight chill run down his spine. He shook it off, chalking it up to the cold night air. At the far end of the cemetery, he came across a large weathered mausoleum. It stood apart from the other graves, its stone facade cracked and covered in ivy. The door, once ornate, was now rusted and hanging ajar, revealing a dark, yawning entrance. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the branches overhead. Alex stopped in his tracks, feeling a strange unease settle in his chest. The air seemed heavier now, thicker somehow. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the cemetery was empty. He was alone. Just the wind, he muttered, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But as he turned his attention back to the mausoleum, something caught his eye, a shadow flickering just beyond the open door. Alex squinted, leaning closer. It was probably just the trick of the moonlight, he reasoned. But then, the shadow moved again, darting across the entrance and disappearing into the darkness within. His heart rate quickened, but he wasn't about to back down now. If anything, this strange occurrence only fueled his curiosity. With a deep breath, Alex stepped toward the mausoleum, peering inside. The interior was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains, and the floor was littered with debris, broken stones, rotting leaves, and something else. Something that looked like bones. Human bones. Alex froze. "No way," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He knelt down, his flashlight sweeping across the ground. The bones were real. He could see the curve of a rib cage, the hollow sockets of a skull half buried in the dirt. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the mausoleum, followed by the slow creak of the door as it swung shut. Alex jumped to his feet, spinning around to face the entrance, but the door was now closed, trapping him inside. "Okay, not funny," he called out, his voice trembling. He stepped toward the door, giving it a hard shove, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to bubble up in his chest as he pounded on the door, the sound echoing in the confined space. Then, from the darkness behind him came a whisper. "Alex." He froze, every hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in there with him. Slowly, he turned around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The mausoleum was empty, at least it seemed to be. But then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Alex, why did you come?" His hands shook as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. But there was no response, only the faint rustling of something moving in the shadows. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shift. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as cracks spread across the floor like spiderwebs. And then, with a sickening crunch, the ground gave way. Alex screamed as he fell, tumbling into the darkness below. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Dazed and gasping for breath, Alex lay there for a moment, trying to gather his bearings. When he finally managed to sit up, he realized he was in some kind of underground chamber. The walls were made of stone, damp and covered in moss, and the air was colder than ever. His flashlight had been lost in the fall, leaving him in near total darkness. But he wasn't alone. Shuffling footsteps echoed from somewhere nearby, growing louder with each passing second. Alex's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around for any sign of an exit, but there was none. He was trapped. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then, out of the shadows, they came. Figures, dozens of them, emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They were skeletal, their flesh hanging from their bones in tattered strips. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Alex backed away, his pulse thundering in his ears. No, this can't be real. But it was. The dead had risen. They moved toward him slowly, their bony hands reaching out as they shuffled closer. Alex stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. In a blind panic, he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the chamber as he fled deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder the further he went, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the dead behind him, their shuffling footsteps growing faster, more urgent. Just as he thought they were about to catch him, he saw it, a faint light at the end of a narrow tunnel. Hope surged through him as he sprinted toward it, his legs burning with effort. He could hear the dead closing in, their bony fingers scraping against the stone walls as they reached for him. He burst through the tunnel, the light blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in the middle of the cemetery once again. The tombstones loomed around him, silent and still, and the night air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. But something was wrong. The cemetery was different now. The headstones were older, more decrepit. The trees were dead, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. And the moon was gone, replaced by an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Alex turned in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. But before he could gather his thoughts, he heard the whisper again. Alex. He spun around, his heart pounding. But there was no one there, just tombstones and shadows. Alex. The whisper was closer now, almost in his ear. He turned again, and this time, he saw her. Standing among the graves was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She wore a tattered, blood-stained dress, her skin as cold as the air around them. And in her hand she held something, a small worn locket. "Why did you come?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Alex couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was paralyzed by fear. The woman took a step closer, her empty eyes locking onto his. "You shouldn't have come, Alex," she whispered. "Now you can't leave." Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to shift once more. The earth trembled, and cracks spread across the cemetery like lightning. Alex stumbled back, his mind screaming for him to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The woman smiled, a cold, lifeless smile. "You belong to us now." And with that, the ground gave way beneath him once more, pulling him down into the darkness. The last thing Alex saw was the woman's face, her hollow eyes staring down at him as the earth swallowed him whole. The next morning, the groundskeeper at Black Hollow Cemetery found the gates wide open. He frowned, shaking his head as he pushed them closed. The old cemetery had been locked tight the night before, and no one should have been able to get in. He muttered to himself about kids and their pranks, about how some people just didn't respect the dead anymore. As he made his rounds walking the familiar paths between the tombstones, something caught his eye. At the far end of the cemetery, near the older forgotten graves, the ground seemed disturbed. The soil was loose, as if someone had dug a shallow hole and hastily covered it up. Curious, the groundskeeper approached, squinting in the early morning light. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. There was no shovel, no tools, nothing to suggest someone had tried to dig anything up. Yet the ground was unmistakably disturbed, as though it had shifted on its own. He crouched down and reached out to touch the soil. It was cold, colder than it should have been, even for a brisk autumn morning. As his fingers brushed the surface, he noticed something partially buried in the dirt. Frowning, he pulled it out, wiping away the earth to reveal a small, worn locket. It was old, tarnished silver, with a faint engraving of a woman's face on the front. The groundskeeper had worked at Black Hollow Cemetery for decades, but he didn't recognize the locket. Something about it felt wrong. He shivered and slipped it into his pocket, deciding he'd figure it out later. As he stood up to leave, a strange feeling washed over him, a sensation of being watched. He turned, scanning the cemetery, but there was no one there. Just the rows of graves and the gnarled trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with him all morning as he worked, gnawing at the back of his mind. It wasn't until later, when he finally took the locket out again, that he noticed something even stranger. The back of the locket had an inscription. It was faint, nearly worn away, but he could still make out the words, "To Alex, forever ours." The groundskeeper frowned, rubbing his thumb over the inscription. Who was Alex? And why would someone leave a locket in such a strange place? Just as he was about to slip the locket back into his pocket, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, sending a chill down his spine. He turned once again, scanning the area, and that's when he saw it. Far across the cemetery, near the mausoleum, stood a figure. At first, the groundskeeper thought it was a statue, or perhaps a trick of the light. But as he squinted, he realized it was a man. The figure stood completely still, staring at him from the shadows of the graves. The groundskeeper's heart skipped a beat. "Hey," he called out, waving his hand. "You're not supposed to be here." But the figure didn't move. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, the groundskeeper swore he heard a faint whisper, something he couldn't quite make out. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Suddenly, the locket in his hand felt heavier, colder. He looked down at it again, and his stomach turned. The engraving on the front had changed. Where there had once been the faint image of a woman, now there were two figures, a man and a woman, both staring back at him with hollow eyes. The groundskeeper dropped the locket, his heart racing. He didn't stick around to inspect the strange graves any longer. Without another word, he hurried back to the gates, locking them tight behind him as he left. From that day on, he never went near the old part of the cemetery again, and whenever anyone mentioned Alex, whether they knew him or not, he would shake his head and tell them the same thing. Don't walk through the cemetery at midnight. Because those who did, they never came back. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear their whispers in the wind, calling out from beneath the earth, forever bound to Black Hollow Cemetery.